Welcome back, everyone. Today we're taking you back in time,
Yeah.
back to 1912, to the story of the Titanic.
Oh,
I know what you're thinking.
yeah.
Another Titanic episode.
Right.
But trust me, this isn't just a rehash of the same old facts.
Yeah.
You've sent in some really incredible source material,
Oh, wow.
including a first-hand account from a survivor and some expert historical analysis.
Wow.
So we're going to delve into those human stories, the ones that often get overshadowed by the sheer scale of the tragedy.
Right.
So get ready, because we're about to uncover a whole new layer to this iconic tale.
It's amazing how, even over a century later, the Titanic still has this hold on our collective imagination. It's not just a shipwreck, it's a symbol of human ambition, technological hubris, and the fragility of life, all rolled into one.
Exactly, and it's the human element that really draws me in. These weren't just names on a passenger list, they were real people with dreams, aspirations, and loved ones all caught up in this unimaginable disaster. So let's set the scene. It's April 14th, 1912, a Sunday evening. The unsinkable Titanic is sailing through the North Atlantic. It's a crystal clear night. The sea is eerily calm, and passengers are enjoying the unparalleled luxury of this state-of-the-art ocean liner.
And what's fascinating is that contrast, right? The
Yeah.
opulence, the carefree atmosphere on board, completely oblivious to the danger that was lurking beneath the surface. It's almost like a Shakespearean tragedy in the making.
Absolutely. It's this juxtaposition that makes the story so compelling. The Titanic was a microcosm of society at the time, with its rigid class divisions and its almost unshakable belief in technological progress.
Mhm.
But then at 11:40 p.m., that sense of security is shattered. The Titanic strikes an iceberg. But here's the thing. It wasn't the ear-splitting crash we often see in movies.
Right. You're right. Many survivors describe the sound as a grating, almost subtle scraping along the ship's side. It speaks to the insidious nature of this disaster. This seemingly minor event would have catastrophic consequences.
It sends shivers down my spine just thinking about it. A barely perceptible sound marking the beginning of such a monumental tragedy.
So what were the initial reactions on board? I mean, was there panic right away?
Interestingly, no. Many passengers, especially those in first class, were completely unfazed. Remember, the Titanic was marketed as the unsinkable ship. They had faith in its advanced safety features, and the crew initially downplayed the incident, assuring everyone that everything was under control.
It's almost understandable, isn't it? That denial, that clinging to the belief that everything would be all right.
Yeah.
But behind the scenes, the situation was far more dire.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Captain Smith, along with the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, inspected the damage and quickly realized the devastating truth. The Titanic was taking on water rapidly and it was going to sink. They knew they had limited time and even more limited lifeboat capacity. This wasn't just a minor mishap, it was a fight for survival.
So at this point, the crew faces an impossible task trying to maintain order while grappling with the horrifying reality that not everyone would make it off the ship alive.
Exactly. And this is where the now infamous Code of Women and Children first comes into play. But what's often overlooked is that this wasn't a formal maritime law. It was more of a social convention, and it was applied inconsistently that night, leading to confusion and even more heartbreak.
So how did that inconsistency play out on the deck of the sinking ship?
Well, our sources describe a chaotic scene with conflicting decisions being made. On one side of the ship, officers were allowing men to fill empty seats in lifeboats after women and children had boarded. On the other side, a much stricter women and children only rule was enforced, leading to lifeboats being lowered with dozens of empty seats. Imagine the ethical dilemma those officers faced in those moments.
It's hard to fathom the weight of those decisions, knowing that every choice could mean life or death for someone. And this is where the personal stories from our sources really hit home. Like the story of Eloise Smith, a survivor who was forced to leave her husband behind even though there was room on her lifeboat. Her account is a chilling reminder of the agonizing choices people had to make and the lifelong guilt that some survivors carried with them.
Her story is incredibly powerful, and it's a testament to the enduring psychological impact of that night. But then you also have stories of incredible sacrifice, like that of Isidore and Ida Strauss,
Yeah.
a wealthy couple who chose to die together rather than be separated. They were offered places on a lifeboat, but Ida refused, famously saying, "We have lived together for many years. Where you go, I go."
That's incredibly moving. Their love and loyalty in the face of certain death is truly inspiring. And of course, there is the story that everyone knows, the story of the band. Imagine this, the ship is sinking, chaos is erupting all around, and yet Wallace Hartley and his fellow musicians continue to play.
Their bravery has become legendary. They played on not to entertain, but to provide a sense of a semblance of normalcy amidst the terror. There's something incredibly powerful about music in times of crisis. It can soothe, it can inspire, and in the case of the Titanic, it offered a poignant soundtrack to a tragedy that would forever be etched in human history. And as the band played their final notes, the situation on deck became increasingly desperate. The lifeboats were gone, the ship was tilting dramatically, and people were making impossible choices, clinging to loved ones, saying their final goodbyes. It must have been absolute pandemonium.
Those final hours must have felt like an eternity for those left behind. Did everyone just accept their fate? Or were there attempts to find other ways to survive? What did the sources reveal about that?
Well, some people clung to hope, desperately searching for any way out. There were attempts to launch the remaining collapsible lifeboats, but they were tangled and difficult to free as the ship listed further into the icy water. Others simply resigned themselves to their fate. Our sources describe men putting on their finest attire, wanting to face death with dignity, while others prayed, wrote farewell notes, or simply held each other close in those final moments.
It's hard to even comprehend the range of emotions people must have been experiencing. Fear, despair, but also maybe moments of incredible courage and selflessness. It seems like those class divisions that were so prominent on board might have melted away in those final moments of shared humanity.
That's a really interesting point. While it's true that a higher proportion of first and second class passengers survived the chaos of the sinking, seems to have blurred those lines in some ways. There are accounts of wealthy passengers giving up their spots on lifeboats for others, and third class passengers helping each other navigate the chaotic decks. It was a complex situation, and those social barriers, while still present, weren't always the deciding factor in who lived and who died.
That adds another layer to the story, doesn't it? It wasn't just a simple case of the rich being saved and the poor being left behind. But even with those acts of courage and selflessness, the reality is that over 1,500 people lost their lives that night. What happened once the ship finally went under? What was the aftermath like for those who had managed to escape in the lifeboats?
Imagine this. You're adrift in a lifeboat in the middle of the North Atlantic. The temperature is freezing, the sea is pitch black, and you're surrounded by the cries of those who are still in the water. The emotional and psychological toll on the survivors must have been immense.
It's hard to even fathom the sheer terror and despair they must have felt. They'd witnessed a horrific tragedy, lost loved ones, and were now facing their own struggle for survival.
Absolutely. They were exhausted, cold, and many were suffering from shock and hypothermia. They had limited supplies, and the constant fear of being lost at sea added to their trauma. Some lifeboats, fearing being capsized, ignored the cries for help from those in the water. But there were also stories of incredible bravery, like Fifth Officer Harold Lowe, who gathered a crew and rowed back into the wreckage to search for survivors.
Did he manage to find anyone?
He did, but tragically, only a handful. The vast majority of those who went into the water that night succumbed to the frigid temperatures. Only one lifeboat besides Lowe's even attempted to go back. It was a scene of unimaginable heartbreak and loss.
It's both incredible and heartbreaking to think about the courage it took for those men to row back into that chaos knowing they might not find anyone alive. What about the Carpathia? We know that ship ultimately rescued the survivors. What was that like?
Well, the Carpathia arrived at the scene at around 4 a.m., several hours after the Titanic had sunk. Imagine seeing those lifeboats bobbing in the darkness, the remnants of the once mighty Titanic scattered across the water. It must have been a sobering sight. The crew worked tirelessly to pull the survivors from the lifeboats, offering them blankets, warm food, and medical attention.
It's amazing to think about the Carpathia's role in this story. They were the glimmer of hope in this horrific tragedy, a symbol of humanity and compassion amidst the loss and despair.
They were, and for the survivors, many of whom had lost everything, the Carpathia was a lifeline, a chance to begin processing the trauma of what they had experienced and to grieve the loved ones they had lost.
As those survivors were sailing to New York aboard the Carpathia, imagine the global shockwave when news of the sinking hit. This wasn't just a shipwreck, this was the sinking of the unsinkable.
It really was a blow to the world's psyche, the symbol of human ingenuity and progress now resting at the bottom of the ocean. It challenged people's faith in technology and raised all sorts of questions about the limits of human ambition.
You can almost picture the newspaper headlines, the disbelief, the collective mourning. It must have been overwhelming. And in the wake of such a tragedy, the natural question is why?
Exactly. Almost immediately, investigations were launched on both sides of the Atlantic. They wanted answers. They needed to understand what went wrong and who was to blame. Was it human error? Was it a flaw in the ship's design? Was it simply bad luck?
And of course, as with any major historical event, the conspiracy theories started swirling.
Oh, absolutely. Some couldn't fathom that a ship as technologically advanced as the Titanic could be brought down by something as simple as an iceberg. There were whispers of insurance scams, corporate sabotage, even curses.
It seems like those kinds of theories often pop up when people are struggling to make sense of the unthinkable. So what did the official investigations actually conclude?
Well, they pointed to a number of contributing factors. The ship's speed in icy waters, for one. The lack of sufficient lifeboats was another major issue. And then there are failures in communication both between the crew and the passengers and between the Titanic and other ships in the area. It really was a perfect storm of circumstances.
So a tragedy with many fathers.
Mm.
But did anyone ultimately take responsibility?
Well, while the investigations did lead to some individuals facing public scrutiny, no one person was solely held accountable for the sinking. Bruce Ismay, for example, the managing director of the White Star Line, came under heavy criticism for surviving the sinking. But our sources suggest he was actively involved in helping load lifeboats, and his decision to board one wasn't entirely out of self-preservation. It was a chaotic situation with split-second decisions being made.
It's easy to judge from our comfortable perspective over a century later. But in that moment, facing a life-or-death situation, who knows how any of us would have reacted. But one thing is certain. The Titanic disaster had a profound impact on maritime safety regulations.
Absolutely. The sinking was a wake-up call for the entire shipping industry. It forced them to confront their complacency and to prioritize passenger safety above all else.
So what specific changes were implemented? I'm guessing lifeboats were at the top of the list.
You're absolutely right. The Titanic carried enough lifeboats for barely half of its passengers and crew. After the disaster, the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS, was established. It mandated that all passenger ships must carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board. It seems like common sense now, but at the time, it was a revolutionary change.
Well, what other changes came about?
Well, communication was another area that saw major improvements. The requirement for a 24-hour radio watch was implemented to ensure that ships could send and receive distress signals at any time. The International Ice Patrol was established to monitor iceberg activity in the North Atlantic, warning ships of potential hazards.
So the legacy of the Titanic is not just one of tragedy, but also of crucial lessons learned and advancements made in the name of safety.
Exactly. The disaster forced the world to take a hard look at maritime safety practices and to make significant changes to prevent such a catastrophe from happening again. And those changes continue to have an impact today, making sea travel significantly safer than it was back in 1912.
The Titanic really serves as a powerful reminder that even the most devastating events can lead to positive change.
I completely agree, and it also highlights the importance of remembering and learning from the past. The stories of those who were on board, both those who survived and those who perished, should never be forgotten.
Well said. The Titanic may be gone, but its story continues to resonate. It's a story about human ambition, the limits of technology, the power of nature, and the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable tragedy. It's a story that reminds us to appreciate the fragility of life and to never take our own safety for granted. And to all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Titanic. We hope you found it insightful, and we encourage you to keep exploring, keep learning, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.
Absolutely. As